Chapter 15 of the Hot Potato Man and Others Matters. The soldier passed by. Following the river, Jimmy ventured toward the city. Prince Brat strode along beside him. Soon as I can, I aim to give you the slip, Jimmy warned. You'll be on your own. The prince said nothing. The tide was low, and they traveled out of sight of the road below a grassy embankment. In the distance, against billowing white clouds, stood a jackstraw jumble of ships' masts. You can fend for yourself, own self, can't you? Jimmy asked suddenly. Of course I can, answered the prince in a stinging voice. I don't need flocks of servants to fetch and carry for me. It's settled then. Settled. Skip off any time you like. With the tide out and white mud flat lay exposed, from long habit, Jimmy kept his eyes peeled for treasure. Sandpipers scattered like mice between him. He spotted a barrel stave and pounced upon it. Trash, remarked the prince. What are you doing? Mudlarking? What? I've got to eat, don't I? I can collect enough driftwood. I can sell it as firewood. The prince shrugged and walked on ahead. Jimmy gazed after him for a moment. What did a prince know about living off the streets? His meals had always appeared on china plates and silver trays as if by magic. Left to himself, he'd starve. It's not my worry, Jimmy muttered. What? You, that's what. If you get hungry enough, you'll scramble back to the castle. The prince glared back at Jimmy and then stooped down to retrieve the broken leg of a chair from the mud. Is this worth anything? Jimmy nodded. Before long, the two of them had collected 3 more barrel staves and the back of the chair. Then Jimmy found something even more valuable to him, a bent and battered bird cage. He could go into business with that. Straighten out would hold rats. They rounded a bend. The crack of a whip sounded in the air like a firecracker. Jimmy crawled up the embankment for a look. A weary old coach was mirrored in a mud hole on the road. The coachman, looking just as old and rickety, held the reins of a 2-horse team and cracked his whip in the air again. Pull, gents. Be good, lads. It's me own fault not leading you around this bog. Me eyesight ain't what it is. Is it, old tars? Jimmy watched for another moment as the horses tried to pull the coach free. The coach was enameled blue with yellow lettering painted on the door panel. Captain Harry Nips, Hot Potato Man. Jimmy crawled over the embankment. A ride to the city would suit him fine. Sir, would you take on a passenger? Here, let me set these barrel staves under the wheels. Don't mind if you do, said Captain Nips. I'm late for the fair as it is. Jimmy busied himself, laying a firm track for the wheels. Prince Brat watched from the edge of the embankment. You must be carrying a heavy load, Jimmy cried out. Try again, Captain. The old man cracked his whip. The horses strained and the coach rolled up out of the bog. Hop in, lad. Jimmy opened the door and saw that the coach was heavily loaded with raw potatoes and a huge iron kettle. Jimmy settled himself as best he could and the coach lurched forward. At last, Jimmy thought, You're free of the prince, but he couldn't resist a backward glance. Prince Brat was standing in the center of the road. He dropped a load of driftwood and merely gazed at the receding coach. Jimmy straightened and folded his arms. The prince wasn't his lookout any longer, but he'd stood there like a wounded bird. Blast him. A prince hadn't cockeyed notion how to fend for himself. Stop, Captain, Jimmy shouted. We left me friend behind. The Hot Potato Man pulled up on the reins. Jimmy leaned out the window. With an arm, he motioned Prince Brat to come along. For an instant, Jimmy thought he saw a smile flash across the prince's face, but it had vanished by the time the heir to the throne joined him inside the coach. They rode in silence. Jimmy wondered what had possessed him to refer to the Prince Brat as his friend. Friend. Cows could give beer first. Then, minutes later, the coach rocked to a sudden halt. Stand and deliver, came a shout. A pair of highwaymen were training pistols on Captain Nips. Jimmy hardly had to peer out. The voice was familiar. It was Hold Your Nose, Billy, and Cutwater. 16, wherein the prince neither bawls nor bellows. Jimmy felt a surge of the creeps. Run for it, he wondered. Instead, he began to burrow out of sight under the loose heap of potatoes. Remember, he whispered to the prince, it's me they're after, not you. Tell him we split up. Tell him I swam the river. Prince Brat merely looked at him. The voices outside boomed. Stand and deliver, I said. And I heard you, exclaimed Captain Nibbs. Deliver what? Potatoes, scurvy rascals? Help yourselves. Hang your potatoes, roared Hold-Your-Nose Billy. Deliver us some information and you can be off. We're after 2 runaway apprentices. Apprentice highwaymen? Captain Nibbs scoffed. Our affair. Girl with a bear said she saw him streaking for the river. You carrying passengers? Jimmy pulled the iron kettle over his head. A coach door was yanked open and Jimmy could hear Cutwater's muffled cackle. Got one, the whipping boy it is. Where's your master, eh? Jimmy held his breath. He had no reason to believe that the prince wouldn't betray him again. There came a stiff pause, and then the Prince Brat said, Swam the river. By then, Hold-Your-Nose Billy had ripped open the opposite coach door, even though the kettle Jimmy imagined he could smell the garlic. Swim the river? Faugh! He'd need scales and fins. Hardly a moment later, the kettle was grabbed off of Jimmy's head, and he stood exposed. Here's the potato we're after, Hold-Your-Nose Billy roared gleefully. Jimmy and the prince were yanked out of the coach, and the big outlaw shouted to Captain Nibbs, Throw me down your horsewhipping and drive on. Hanging on each boy by the scruff of the neck, the highwaymen scrambled out of sight below the embankment. Hold-Your-Nose Billy looked angry enough to throttle Jimmy on the spot. Tricked me, did you? He bellowed. Flumboxed me with your fancy quill scratching. The game's up, Jimmy thought. He's tumbled that the ransom note ain't worth scat. But trying to look at as innocent as possible, he replied, Sir, a gold sack or 2 would have satisfied me, and Cutwater, snarled the hairy outlaw. Greedy ain't our middle name. But you, raising the ante to a great cartload, reckoned to slow us down, and didn't you? It would be easier to drag around a dead horse. If we ain't light-footed, we're caught. That was your scheme. What a pair of fools, Jimmy thought. That hadn't been his scheme at all. You've got it all wrong, he declared. I swear it. Ah, enough plunder to burden us directly to the gallows, eh? Hold-Your-Nose Billy continued. Well, here's a whipping you won't ever forget. He snapped Captain Nibbs' whip in the air and to get the feel of it. Here's the whipping boy, Cutwater put in. You said it'll go powerful worse for us if we thrash the prince himself. Hold-Your-Nose Billy nodded sharply. Cutwater upturned the prince, holding him by the ankles in the air. Go to it, Billy. Jimmy finally found his voice. Lay down the whip, he commanded with a princely air. Don't you have an ounce of sense between you? Hold your gab, simpletons. You can just fill your pockets with plunder and be light-footed as ever, Jimmy declared. Nobody flumbuxes Hold-Your-Nose Billy and gets away with it. The whip snapped across the prince's back. Jimmy held his breath. He knew what it felt like. He saw that the Prince Brat had set his jaws just as Jimmy had always done, and not a sound escaped his lips. Harder, Cutwater advised. You didn't raise a peep out of him. The big man let fly again. He must have a hide like an elephant, said Cutwater. He don't feel a thing. He'll feel this, Hold-Your-Nose Billy thundered, and the leather whistled through the air. The prince's jacket was being shredded. Ball out, Jimmy shouted. He dreamed of seeing the prince whipped, but now that it was happening, he found no satisfaction in it. Holler, cry out. I won't tell anyone. But Prince Brat only girdled himself for the next blow. From the top of the embankment came an outraged voice. Betsy and her dancing bear stood there. Ruffian, she cried out. What are you doing to that poor boy? No business of yours, snarled Cutwater. Stop it. But Hold-Your-Nose Billy raised the whip again. The next thing Jimmy knew, the girl had slipped the rope from around the bear's neck. Sick 'em, Petunia! Go get 'em!